The lonely trail between Carson City and Salt Lake once bustled with life. Stagecoaches rumbling through the rugged terrain carrying passengers, mail, and precious cargo. But now, an eerie silence had fallen over the route, broken only by whispers of fear and the occasional distant gunshot. They called it the Death Trail now. Over the past 6 months, 11 stagecoaches had set out, and only 3 had reached their destination. The others had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth and questions that haunted the dreams of every traveler in the territory. Sheriff Thomas Morgan of Bitter Creek stood at the edge of town, squinting as another plume of black smoke rose in the distance. "Damn it all," he muttered, adjusting his weathered hat. "That's the 3rd one this month." By the time the sheriff and his deputies reached the scene, there was little left to investigate. The stagecoach had been reduced to charred wood and twisted metal. Bodies lay scattered, drivers, guards, passengers, all gunned down with military precision. No survivors, no witnesses, and strangely, no tracks leading away from the massacre. "It's like they're ghosts," Deputy Wilson said, his young voice cracking. "How do they just disappear?" The sheriff knelt down, examining a boot print partially hidden beneath a scorch mark. "Not ghosts," he replied grimly. "Just men who know this land better than we do." Back in Bitter Creek, the townsfolk gathered at Holloway's saloon, their faces etched with worry. The stagecoach was their lifeline. Mail, supplies, medicine, all came through on those wheels. Without it, they were isolated, vulnerable. "My brother was supposed to be on that coach," Martha Collins said, her hands trembling around her handkerchief. "He was bringing medicine for my Timmy. What are we supposed to do now?" The fear was palpable, spreading through the town like wildfire. Some claimed it was a band of rogue Apaches. Others swore it was the work of the notorious Bradley gang. But those who had seen the aftermath knew better. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated, strategic, military. "I heard from a prospector who barely escaped last week," said Old Man Jenkins, his voice carrying across the hushed saloon. "Said he recognized one of them attackers, a deserter from the 7th Cavalry, man named Kane, Silas Kane." The name fell like a stone in still water, sending ripples of recognition through the older patrons. Kane had been a decorated officer once, before something broke inside him during the war. He'd led his men into a civilian settlement and unleashed hell. When ordered to stand trial, he and his most loyal men disappeared into the wilderness. Sheriff Morgan posted riders to Carson City and Salt Lake, begging for help. But the responses were always the same. They were stretched too thin, couldn't spare the men, would send help when available. Empty promises that wouldn't stop the killing. As winter approached, the situation grew desperate. The last stagecoach attempting the journey had turned back halfway, the driver pale with fear as he described watching distant riders tracking them from the ridgelines. "They're watching every move," he told the sheriff. "They know the land, every pass, every shortcut, every hiding place. They're playing with us like a cat with a mouse." That night, as the town council debated their options, a stranger arrived. He sat silently in the corner, observing. When Mayor Wilson suggested abandoning the route entirely, the stranger finally spoke up. "You do that," he said, his voice carrying the weight of hard years, "and you'll be giving them exactly what they want. Control, power, and once they have it, they'll come for the town next." Every head turned to face him, a lean, weathered man with eyes that had seen too much of the world's darkness. "And who might you be?" the sheriff demanded. The stranger stood slowly, revealing a star-shaped scar on his right hand, the mark every Pony Express rider carried. "Name's Hollister," he replied. "Benjamin Hollister, and I believe I might know a way to take back your trail." Before we go further, let us know in the comments, would you dare ride this haunted trail? And have you ever traveled through a place with a dangerous reputation? Night fell over the Badlands as a lone figure crouched behind a jagged outcropping, watching the abandoned fort through a brass spyglass. The flickering of campfires revealed silhouettes moving with practiced discipline. Men standing guard, patrolling in precise patterns only military men would know. Benjamin Hollister tucked the spyglass away, his weathered face grim in the moonlight. He'd spent 2 weeks tracking the deserters, learning their routines and counting their numbers. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Silas Kane hadn't just formed a gang, he'd built an army. Inside the fort's crumbling walls, 30 former soldiers now answered to Kane alone. They'd transformed the abandoned outpost into an impenetrable stronghold, with reinforced walls, lookout positions covering every approach, and enough supplies to withstand a siege. "Impressive setup they've got," a voice whispered beside Hollister. It belonged to Silas Crow, a Comanche tracker who'd once ridden alongside Hollister during their Pony Express days. "Military precision," Hollister muttered. "Kane always was a tactical genius. That's what makes him so dangerous." Through the night, they observed as Stagecoach plunder was unloaded and organized. Crates of ammunition, barrels of whiskey, sacks of mail, and strong boxes still marked with Wells Fargo insignia. The operation ran with the efficiency of a military outpost, not the chaotic revelry of typical outlaws. "Look there," Crow pointed to a small building near the center of the fort. 2 armed guards stood at attention outside its door. "Important prisoners or valuable cargo?" Hollister focused his spyglass. Through a small window, he caught a glimpse of a woman in a torn dress, her wrists bound, but her eyes defiant. "Both," he responded grimly. As dawn approached, riders galloped into the fort, dust billowing behind them. Kane emerged from his quarters to meet them, tall, imposing, with a distinctive cavalry saber at his hip. The men saluted him, a gesture that spoke volumes about the chain of command. These weren't just deserters. They remained soldiers in their minds, fighting a new war with Kane as their general. The reporting scout pointed toward Bitter Creek, and Kane's face split into a cold smile that sent chills down Hollister's spine. "They're planning something big," Crow whispered. "Not planning," Hollister corrected. "They're ready to execute." Back in Bitter Creek, Hollister shared his findings with Sheriff Morgan and a select few townsfolk. "Kane's not just hitting stagecoaches for money," he explained. "He's systematically cutting off all routes to the major settlements. He's starving you out, waiting for you to get desperate enough to abandon the town." "But why?" the sheriff demanded. "What does he want with a backwater town like Bitter Creek?" "Control of the crossroads," Hollister explained. "From that fort, they can dominate every trail between Carson City, Salt Lake, and the Northern Territories. It's strategic, military thinking. And those deserters follow him like he's still their commanding officer," added Crow. "They have scouts posted on every ridge, informants in neighboring towns. Nothing moves through this territory without Kane knowing about it." Mayor Wilson paled. "So we're already surrounded." "Have been for months," Hollister confirmed. "You just didn't know it yet." The implications settled over the room like a shroud. This wasn't just about robbed stagecoaches anymore. It was about survival. "So what do we do?" asked the sheriff, desperation edging his voice. Hollister's eyes hardened. "We fight back, but not the way they're expecting. Not with badges and laws and traditional poses." "Then how?" Hollister exchanged a knowing look with Crow. "We fight them with something they won't see coming. The men who know these trails even better than they do." The stagecoach rocked violently as it raced across the barren landscape, horses straining against their harnesses. Inside, Judge William Montgomery dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief while his daughter Eleanor clutched her seat as the coach hit another bump. "Father, perhaps we should have waited for a military escort," she whispered, peering anxiously through the dust-streaked window. The judge straightened his waistcoat with dignity. At 65, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had sentenced countless criminals to hang. "Nonsense, Eleanor. I've been traveling these routes for 30 years. No deserter will prevent me from reaching that courthouse." The driver's urgent shout cut through their conversation. "Riders coming in fast. 6. No, 8 of them." Eleanor's face paled as she caught sight of the approaching horsemen, their faces hidden behind bandanas, rifles gleaming in the midday sun. The judge reached beneath his coat, revealing a Colt revolver that had seen better days. "Stay down," he ordered his daughter, his voice firm. The first shots rang out with military precision, not wild firing, but calculated shots that dropped both outriders instantly. The coach lurched as one of the horses took a bullet, sending the vehicle careening toward a shallow ravine. "Hold on!" the judge shouted as the stagecoach tipped, then crashed onto its side, throwing them against the interior wall. Dazed, Eleanor heard heavy boots approaching, men barking orders with the efficiency of soldiers. The door was wrenched open, sunlight flooding the compartment. "Well, well," a deep voice drawled. "Look what we have here. The Honorable Judge Montgomery himself." Through the doorway loomed a tall figure, sunlight glinting off a cavalry saber at his hip. His once distinguished military uniform had been modified with trophies taken from victims, gold watch chains, silver spurs, and a marshal's badge worn mockingly on his chest. "Silas Kane," the judge growled in recognition. "You're a disgrace to that uniform." Kane's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That uniform was a disgrace to me, Judge. After all we sacrificed in that war, they wanted to court-martial me for doing what needed to be done." The judge didn't hesitate. He raised his revolver and fired, the bullet grazing Kane's cheek before he could react. 2 more shots found their marks in the deserters standing behind their leader, dropping them where they stood. Kane's hand flew to his bleeding face, his expression morphing from surprise to murderous rage. "You'll regret that, old man." What followed haunted Eleanor's nightmares for years to come. Her father fought bravely, but he was 1 man against 6. They beat him mercilessly before Kane finally delivered the killing blow himself, using his saber with cold precision. "Bring the girl," Kane ordered, wiping his blade clean on the judge's coat. "She's our insurance policy now." Eleanor was dragged from the wreckage, her grief turning to cold terror as Kane approached her, his face still streaming blood from her father's bullet. "Your daddy was the 3rd judge to sentence me to hang," he said quietly. "The other 2 also died slowly. Remember that before you consider doing anything foolish." In Bitter Creek, the news of Judge Montgomery's murder and his daughter's abduction spread like wildfire. Sheriff Morgan called an emergency town meeting at the church, but it quickly descended into chaos. "They're untouchable!" shouted Peterson, the banker. "We should negotiate, offer them safe passage and regular supplies if they'll leave the stagecoaches alone." "Negotiate with murderers?" bellowed Hargrove, the blacksmith. "I say we form a posse and hunt them down." "And end up like the judge?" countered another voice. "Kane's men are former military. They'd slaughter any posse we send." As the argument escalated, Sheriff Morgan fired his revolver into the ceiling, silencing the crowd. "Enough! This bickering won't save Eleanor or reopen our supply lines." From the back of the church, Benjamin Hollister watched silently, measuring the town's resolve. When he finally rose to speak, the room grew quiet. 3 weeks into Kane's blockade, Bitter Creek was slowly dying. The general store's shelves stood bare. The saloon served watered-down whiskey, and Dr. Wilson had taken to rationing what little medicine remained. Fear permeated every corner of town like a thick fog, choking out hope with each passing day. Sheriff Morgan gazed out his office window at the empty main street. Most folks stayed indoors now, jumping at shadows and strange sounds. The last rider he'd sent for help hadn't returned. That made 4. "Sheriff!" Deputy Wilson burst through the door, winded from running. "The mayor called another meeting. Says it can't wait." The town hall was packed despite the risk of gathering. Faces gaunt with worry turned as the sheriff entered. Mayor Peterson stood at the front, his normally immaculate suit now wrinkled from nights spent pacing instead of sleeping. "We've received a message," the mayor announced, holding up a blood-stained envelope. "From Kane himself." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "He's offering terms," Peterson continued. He'll allow one supply wagon through each month, in exchange for 20% of all business profits and complete authority over who travels our roads." "That's extortion!" shouted Williams, the livery owner. "It's survival," countered Andrews, the shopkeeper. "My children haven't had proper food in days." The debate erupted into shouts, accusations of cowardice, battling desperate pleas for practicality. The division was exactly what Kane had intended, the town tearing itself apart from within. Sheriff Morgan tried to restore order, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. The community that had once stood united was fracturing under pressure. From his corner, Benjamin Hollister observed the scene with narrowed eyes. Beside him sat Silas Crow, both men still as statues, while the town convulsed with fear and anger. They exchanged a glance. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. When Hollister finally stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, heads turned one by one until silence fell. "You folks are making a mistake," he said, his voice carrying without effort. "Kane doesn't want your money. He doesn't want an arrangement. He's watching you crumble, and once you're broken, he'll take everything." "What choice do we have?" someone shouted. "We're not soldiers." "No," Hollister agreed. "But I know men who are. Men who rode when no one else would. Men who carried the mail through Apache country and outran war parties for a living." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the star-shaped brand of the Pony Express. "You don't need an army. You need riders who know this land better than Kane, who can fight, who ain't afraid of the trails." For the first time in weeks, something flickered across the townsfolk's faces that resembled hope. Dawn broke over the eastern hills as Benjamin Hollister mounted his horse, cinching the saddle with practiced hands that hadn't forgotten their skill despite the passing years. Sheriff Morgan approached, offering a canteen and a concerned frown. "You sure about this, Hollister? Finding these men won't be easy. Some might be dead, others won't want to be found." Hollister's weathered face remained impassive. "The Pony Express chose men with something to prove and nowhere else to go. Those kinds don't die easy, and they don't forget their debts." With that, he spurred his horse eastward, dust billowing behind him as Bitter Creek shrank in the distance. His mind tumbled through memories of faces and hideouts, safe houses and secret trails that only the mail riders had known. His first stop was a small cattle ranch nestled against the foothills where Jesse "Iron" Tate had settled after the Express disbanded. As Hollister approached, a rifle shot kicked up dirt mere inches from his horse's hooves. "That's close enough, stranger," called a voice from the ranch house porch. "Next one goes through whatever you value most." Hollister didn't flinch. "Your aim's getting sloppy, Iron. Time was you could shoot a playing card at 200 yards. A moment of silence followed. Then a tall figure emerged, squinting against the sun. Tate's red beard had threads of gray now, but his eyes remained sharp as a hawk's. "Benjamin Hollister," he said, lowering his rifle. "Thought you'd be dead by now." "Not yet," Hollister replied, "though Kane's deserters are doing their best to change that." Inside Tate's modest cabin, Hollister laid out the situation at Bitter Creek. Tate listened silently, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. "So, you're recruiting," he finally said. "For what, a suicide mission?" "For justice," Hollister countered. "And to remind Kane what happens when you cross the Express." Tate's eyes narrowed. "Kane? Silas Kane? That butcher from the 7th? "The same, and he's got himself an army of deserters." A dark look crossed Tate's face. "3 of those deserters killed my brother at Shiloh. Shot him in the back while retreating." He reassembled his rifle with sharp clicks. "I'm in." Together they rode north to the Comanche territories where Silas Crow's people had settled. Despite initial suspicion from the tribal guards, Crow emerged from his lodge, arms crossed but eyes curious. "The white man's problems are not my concern anymore, old friend," he said, after hearing their proposal. "Kane's men have been raiding your hunting grounds," Hollister replied. "Those missing braves? It wasn't Apache." Something dangerous flashed in Crow's eyes. "You are certain?" "Found this near their last ambush site." Hollister produced a cavalry button. 7th Regiment. By nightfall, Crow rode alongside them, his tracking skills undiminished by time. Their final stop was a small mining town, where Hank Dobbs had found work breaking horses too wild for ordinary wranglers. 4 riders approached Bitter Creek under cover of darkness, their silhouettes merging with the night. The townsfolk had been warned of their coming, but still, armed men stood nervously at the town's perimeter, jumping at every shadow until a low whistle confirmed it was Hollister returning. Sheriff Morgan greeted them in his office, maps spread across his desk, illuminated by lamplight. 4 of you against 30 deserters, he said, shaking his head. Those aren't odds I'd bet on. Hank Dobbs, a barrel-chested man with hands like sledgehammers, chuckled. Odds never bothered us much in the express days. Remember Comanche Ridge, Hollister? 3 riders against 15 warriors, Hollister nodded. Mail still got through. Iron Tate ran a calloused finger along the stagecoach route on the map. Kane's strength is in his discipline and numbers, but he's playing a static game, defending territory, maintaining blockades. We need to make him react, force him to split his forces. Crow crouched by the map, studying it with intense focus. There are trails here and here, he indicated, known only to my people and the express riders. Kane's scouts won't be watching them. Over the next 3 days, they recruited a dozen willing townsfolk with shooting experience, mainly young men eager to prove themselves and older veterans who remembered what it meant to fight for something beyond themselves. Training began before dawn each morning in a secluded canyon outside town. Tate drilled them ruthlessly in marksmanship, making them fire until their shoulders bruised and their eyes burned from focusing down the sights. Dobbs taught them to ride like the wind, to become one with their horses in ways that would confound soldiers trained to fight in formation. Crow showed them how to move invisibly across terrain, to read tracks and signs, to predict their enemies' movements before they made them. And Hollister? He taught them courage, the same unflinching resolve that had carried mail across hostile territories when the nation needed connection most. Kane expects a direct assault or surrender, Hollister explained during strategy sessions. We'll give him neither. We hit and vanish. Take out his scouts first, blind him, then his supply lines. Make his men jumpy, sleep-deprived, questioning his leadership. Their first strike came at dawn against a deserter outpost. 3 men stationed on a ridge overlooking the main road. Crow approached silently from behind while Tate positioned himself on an opposing ridge, rifle steady. The deserters never knew what hit them. 2 clean shots from Tate's rifle and 1 silent takedown by Crow's hunting knife. By week's end, 8 of Kane's scouts had disappeared, and a supply wagon bound for the fort had been captured, yielding valuable ammunition and intelligence. A prisoner taken during the raid confirmed their suspicions. Kane was planning a major assault on Bitter Creek, intending to make an example of the town for daring to resist. We've rattled his cage, Hollister told his men. Now he'll make mistakes. Bitter Creek transformed under the looming threat of Kane's attack. Women hammered boards across windows while children filled sandbags. Men converted the church, saloon, and general store into fortified positions, creating firing lanes and escape routes between buildings. What had begun as a desperate defense was now a calculated trap, designed by men who had spent years outrunning death. They'll come from the east, Hollister explained to the town council, pointing at the map. The western approach is too exposed, and Kane's military training won't let him sacrifice that advantage. The night before the expected attack, a strange calm settled over the town. Families huddled in root cellars and reinforced basements. Defenders took their positions, checking ammunition one final time. In the sheriff's office, the 4 express riders shared a bottle of whiskey, their weathered faces illuminated by a single lantern. Just like old times, Dobbs said, raising his glass, except we're a hell of a lot older and slower. Speak for yourself, Tate replied with a wry smile. I can still outshoot any man half my age. Crow, who rarely drank, studied the amber liquid in his glass. The spirits tell me some of us may join our ancestors tomorrow. Hollister nodded solemnly. Then we'll give them a story worth telling around their fires." They touched glasses as the church bell struck midnight. The signal. Kane's army had been spotted approaching. "Riders coming!" The whispered alert passed from lookout to lookout as 30 mounted deserters emerged from the darkness, Kane at the lead. They halted just beyond rifle range, their formation disciplined and ominous in the moonlight. From his hidden position on the saloon roof, Hollister observed Kane's tactical assessment. The deserter leader was scanning the too quiet town, sensing something amiss in the complete darkness and silence. This was the critical moment. If Kane suspected a trap, he might retreat and change his approach. Hollister gave the signal. A single lantern appeared in the church tower, seemingly accidental, quickly extinguished. It was enough. Kane raised his saber, believing he'd spotted a nervous sentry, and his men surged forward into the town. The first volley came from hidden riflemen on rooftops, dropping 8 deserters before they realized what was happening. Kane's men scattered for cover, returning fire with military precision despite their surprise. The battle erupted across the town, gunfire echoing between buildings, horses screaming, men shouting orders through the chaos. Tate's rifle spoke again and again from the hotel balcony, each shot finding its mark. Crow moved like a ghost through the back alleys, his knife claiming 3 deserters who thought themselves safely hidden. Dobbs led a mounted charge from behind the livery stable, 6 riders hitting Kane's flank when they least expected it. Yet Kane adapted quickly, rallying his men and establishing a defensive position around the general store. He had captured 5 townspeople as hostages, using them as shields while consolidating his forces. "It's a stalemate," Sheriff Morgan whispered to Hollister as they crouched behind an overturned wagon. "We can't rush them without sacrificing those hostages." Hollister's eyes narrowed, watching Kane shouting orders from the store's porch. "Then it's time to end this the old way," he said grimly, "man to man." Dawn painted the sky blood red as smoke drifted between Bitter Creek's battered buildings. The firing had ceased an hour earlier, both sides entrenched in a deadly standoff. 20 deserters remained, barricaded inside the general store with their hostages. 14 townspeople lay dead or wounded, their sacrifice buying time, but not victory. Hollister surveyed the scene from behind a water trough, his old Colt heavy in his hand. Beside him, Tate nursed a bullet graze across his shoulder. "We're running out of options," Tate muttered. "Those hostages won't last much longer. Kane's getting desperate." As if confirming his words, Kane's voice bellowed from the store's broken window. "Hollister, I know you're out there. Show yourself or I start putting bullets in these fine townspeople." A woman's scream punctuated his threat, followed by Eleanor Montgomery's defiant voice. "Don't listen to him. He'll kill us all anyway." The crack of a pistol silenced her, followed by Kane's cold laughter. "That was just a warning shot, Hollister. Next one won't be." Hollister exchanged glances with his fellow riders. They'd faced death together more times than they could count, but this was different. This wasn't outrunning danger. It was walking straight toward it. "I'm going out there," Hollister said quietly. Crow gripped his arm. "It's what he wants. He'll kill you, then kill everyone anyway." "Maybe," Hollister nodded. "But I've got a plan." He quickly outlined his thinking, watching understanding dawn in his companion's eyes. With deliberate slowness, Hollister stood and stepped into the street, hands raised shoulder high but conspicuously still holding his Colt. "I'm here, Kane," he called. "Let's end this between us. Your quarrel's with me now." The store's door creaked open, and Kane emerged, pushing Eleanor ahead of him as a shield, his saber pressed against her throat. His uniform was torn and bloodied, but his eyes burned with the same fanatical light that had led him to desertion years ago. "Benjamin Hollister," Kane sneered. "The famous Pony Express rider. Not so fast anymore, are you, old man?" "Fast enough," Hollister replied evenly. "Let these people go. This is between soldiers now." Kane laughed. "Soldiers? You were never a soldier. Just a mail boy riding through the dust." "And yet here we are," Hollister said. Me standing, many of your men not." Kane's expression hardened. "A duel, then? Is that what you're proposing?" "That's right. You win. Your men leave town with all the supplies they can carry. I win, you surrender, and the hostages go free." A tense silence followed as Kane considered the offer. His eyes darted around the street, assessing angles, distances, potential traps. "What's to stop your men from shooting me the moment I release this lovely hostage?" Kane demanded. "My word," Hollister said simply. "Something you might have forgotten the value of." The barb struck home. Kane roughly shoved Eleanor aside, keeping his saber drawn. "Your word means nothing, but I'll enjoy killing you all the same." The two men faced each other in the dusty street, 20 paces apart. Behind windows and barricades, the town held its collective breath. "On the count of 3, Hollister called, "just like civilized men." Kane smiled coldly. 1, 2, Hollister responded. But Kane, true to his nature, drew before 3 left his lips. Kane's shot cracked through the morning air, but Hollister was already moving. Years of riding through hostile territory had taught him to anticipate treachery. He rolled sideways, his own Colt barking once, twice. The first bullet struck Kane's shooting arm, spinning him halfway around. The second caught him in the thigh, dropping him to one knee. "You missed," Hollister said, steadily advancing. Kane's face contorted with rage and pain. "Kill him!" he bellowed to his men. "Kill them all!" But the deserters hesitated. Their leader's dishonorable move in the duel had shaken their already fragile loyalty. Before they could decide, Tate's rifle spoke from the hotel, dropping a deserter who had aimed at Hollister. Crow and Dobbs emerged from their hidden positions, weapons trained on the general store. "It's over, Kane," Hollister declared, now standing over the wounded man. "Order your men to surrender." Kane lunged suddenly, his cavalry saber flashing in the morning light. Hollister jumped back, but not quickly enough. The blade sliced across his ribs, drawing a line of crimson. He staggered, nearly dropping his pistol. With a triumphant snarl, Kane struggled to his feet, preparing for a killing thrust. "The great express rider," he taunted. "Too slow, after all." Hollister met his eyes squarely. "Fast enough for this." His left hand came up from beneath his coat, revealing a derringer, the hidden backup piece every rider had carried. At point-blank range, the small pistol roared, and Kane froze, a look of disbelief spreading across his face as he glanced down at the spreading red stain on his chest. "You—" Kane gasped, his saber falling from nerveless fingers. "You cheated." "No," Hollister replied grimly. "I survived. There's a difference." Kane collapsed in the dirt, his life bleeding out with each labored breath. "My men," he wheezed. "They'll avenge me." Hollister turned to face the general store. "Your men are done fighting for a lost cause," he called out. "Surrender now and you'll get a fair trial. Continue, and none of you leave Bitter Creek alive." For several tense moments, silence gripped the street. Then, one by one, rifles and pistols clattered to the ground as deserters emerged with their hands raised. Sheriff Morgan and his deputies moved in quickly, binding the prisoners. Eleanor rushed forward, tearfully embracing Hollister despite his wound. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You brought them to justice." "Not me," Hollister corrected, gesturing to his fellow riders who now stood beside him. "Us. Some debts can only be paid together." Later that afternoon, as Dr. Wilson stitched Hollister's wound, the first legitimate stagecoach in months rolled into Bitter Creek. The passengers descended to a hero's welcome, bringing mail, medicine, and news that U.S. Marshals were on their way to collect Kane's surviving men. "The trail's open again," Sheriff Morgan announced to cheers from the gathered townspeople. As prisoners were loaded into wagons for the journey to the territorial court, Hollister watched from the doctor's porch, his companions at his side. "What happens now?" Crow asked quietly. Hollister gazed at the horizon, where the stagecoach route stretched toward distant mountains. "Now justice rides these trails again." 5 years passed like a summer wind across the territories. Bitter Creek had transformed from a struggling outpost to a thriving community, its position at the crossroads of major stagecoach routes, bringing prosperity and growth. New buildings lined the main street, a school had opened its doors, and the stagecoaches arrived with clockwork regularity. On the anniversary of what townspeople now called the Battle of Bitter Creek, Mayor Eleanor Montgomery, formerly Eleanor Judge, unveiled a bronze monument in the town square. It depicted 4 riders on horseback, their faces cast in eternal vigilance as they looked outward toward the trails they had reclaimed. 5 years ago, she addressed the gathered crowd, this town faced extinction at the hands of men who sought to rule through fear and violence. When traditional authority failed us, 4 men answered a different call, one that spoke to an older code of the frontier. The crowd's attention shifted to the front row, where Sheriff Morgan sat alongside 3 of the honored riders, Tate, Crow, and Dobbs. Conspicuously absent was Benjamin Hollister, who had ridden out of town just days after Kane's defeat, declining all rewards and recognition. Though one of our heroes couldn't join us today, Eleanor continued, the courage of these men reminds us that justice on the frontier isn't just about laws written on paper. Sometimes it's about the willingness to stand when others would kneel, to ride when others would hide. After the ceremony, curious children surrounded the 3 former express riders, peppering them with questions. "Is it true Mr. Hollister once outran 20 Comanche warriors?" a wide-eyed boy asked. Tate chuckled. 25 by my count. And he delivered the mail on time, too. "Did you really shoot a man's ear off at 400 yards? Another child asked. 450, Tate corrected with a wink, but only because I was aiming for his hat. As twilight painted the sky in deepening blues, the 3 riders gathered at the saloon, sharing stories with Sheriff Morgan over glasses of fine whiskey, a far cry from the raw spirits they'd once consumed between dangerous rides. "Any word from Hollister?" Morgan asked, refilling their glasses. Crow nodded solemnly. "A letter came last month. He's up north near the Dakota territories. Still riding, still watching the trails." "Some men can't settle," Dobbs added. "The trail gets in their blood." Outside, a lone rider passed through town, his features obscured by the gathering dusk. Only the most observant might have noticed the star-shaped brand on his right hand as he tipped his hat toward the monument. That night, as Bitter Creek slept peacefully, stories were told in dozens of homes, tales of 4 riders who had faced impossible odds to restore justice to the trails. With each telling, the legend grew. The deserters became more numerous, Kane more diabolical, the riders more heroic. And somewhere out on the frontier, Benjamin Hollister continued his solitary journey, carrying a different kind of mail now. The burden of ensuring that the trails remained safe for all who traveled them. Not for glory or reward, but because some men are born to ride, to watch, to stand against the darkness. For as long as there were trails to protect and justice to uphold, the legend of the last Pony Express riders would endure, whispered around campfires and passed from one generation to the next. A reminder that the true spirit of the West wasn't found in gold or guns, but in the courage of those who refused to surrender to tyranny. The saloon on the outskirts of Deadwood was the kind of place respectable folks avoided. Its weathered boards and sagging porch spoke of hard years and harder men. Inside, coal oil lamps cast flickering shadows across tables where fortunes changed hands with the turn of a card and lives were wagered on the draw of a gun. In a corner booth, 4 young outlaws celebrated their latest robbery, spreading stolen gold coins across the scarred tabletop. Their laughter cut through the haze of tobacco smoke as they boasted of their exploits. "Did you see that guard's face when I put a bullet through his hat?" the youngest one crowed. Barely 20, but already with 3 notches on his gun. "Next time aim lower," another replied, drawing a finger across his throat. "Dead men don't identify outlaws in court." At the bar, an old cowboy hunched over his whiskey, seemingly lost in his own thoughts. His weathered face mapped decades on the frontier, his calloused hands bearing the scars of countless struggles. Though his clothes were trail-worn, something in his posture suggested a dignity that hard years couldn't erase. The outlaws' conversation drifted toward tales they'd heard about the territory. "You boys ever heard about those Pony Express riders who took down Kane's army?" one asked, his words slightly slurred from drink. "Old wives' tales," scoffed another. "No mail carriers could outfight trained deserters." "I heard that Hollister fella could shoot the whiskers off a cat at 100 yards, the first insisted. "Hollister, Tate, all those so-called heroes?" The leader laughed dismissively. "If they ever existed, they're long dead or drooling in rocking chairs by now." The old cowboy at the bar straightened slightly, his hand tightening around his glass. "Funny thing about legends," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the room. "Sometimes they ride back when you least expect them." As the outlaws turned toward him, recognition dawned in their leader's eyes. Outside, barely visible in the moonlight, 3 mounted figures waited. Tate, Crow, and Dobbs, summoned by a letter from their old friend. The young outlaws never knew their past had finally caught up with them. If you thought this was a wild story, wait until you hear what happens in the next one.